Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are taking a fascinating look at the hidden architecture of activism. We see angry protests on the evening news or trending hashtags totally taking over our feeds. And it's super easy to assume it's all just spontaneous, raw emotion. But the data tells a completely different story. In reality, successful social movements are highly calculated, strategic machines. Literally every single thing you see, from the specific people holding the megaphones down to the exact wording on their signs, well, it's the result of deliberate choices and some really intense internal trade-offs.
All right, let's dive into this. To really understand how these movements operate, we're going to break this explainer down into 6 key areas: the myth of the monolith, broad appeal versus core purity, reading the societal climate, why do people join, avenues of real change, and finally, tactics surrounding violence and structure. So, starting us off with Section 1, the myth of the monolith. Probably the single most common mistake we make when analyzing any movement, whether we're talking about feminism, civil rights, environmentalism, you name it, is treating it like it's a single unified entity with one cohesive brain. But it's really not. A movement is actually split up into very distinct layers of commitment. Right at the center, you've got the leadership or the bureaucracy, the people actively steering the ship. Then, wrapping around them is the core base. These are your highly committed folks. They're the ones consistently turning out to protests, doing the grueling on-the-ground organizing, and donating their hard-earned cash. And finally, on the outer ring, you have the sympathizers. These are the people who might, say, retweet a post or nod along in conversation, but they aren't really investing heavy resources. Understanding these layers is absolutely vital because organizers constantly have to juggle whose voices get to actually shape the movement's goals. Which brings us to Section 2, broad appeal versus core purity. I want you to put yourself in an organizer's shoes for just a second. Think about this central strategic dilemma. Is it better to have 1 million casual supporters who kinda, sorta agree with you? Or are you better off with 1,000 absolute diehards who completely and totally align with your most radical visions? You literally have to choose. Why? Because the tactics you use to attract one group are almost guaranteed to alienate the other. Let's break down the pros and cons here neutrally. If you go with a broad, inclusive strategy, you instantly become more palatable to the general public. We're talking more votes, way more mainstream media attention, and potentially massive financial backing from a huge base. But the trade-off? It's pretty severe. You generally have to water down your message. You might find yourself awkwardly pandering to the political center or using a bunch of corporate speak just to avoid ruffling feathers. On the flip side, if you choose to remain small and highly committed, your message stays ideologically pure. You get to maintain a true safe space for vulnerable groups without compromising your core principles. Plus, there's way less infighting and your demands are crystal clear. The catch, though, is that by staying small, you might totally lack the critical political capital and sheer numbers needed to actually force systemic legislative change. It's a massive calculated gamble either way. Moving right along to Section 3, reading the societal climate. Now, a movement can't just pick its internal tactics in a vacuum. Organizers have to intensely read the room, meaning the external world. They are mapping out 2 huge factors: cultural attitudes and political opportunity windows. On the cultural side, they're asking, is the average person negative towards our cause right now? Are they just apathetic and focused on their own daily lives? Or are they already highly sympathetic? Your entire messaging strategy pivots based on that answer. Then you've got the political window. Is the system completely closed, like in an authoritarian regime where voting is essentially useless? Or is it open, where politicians are desperate to pander to your specific voting bloc? You're obviously not going to bring a get-out-the-vote strategy to a closed dictatorship, just like you wouldn't use extreme radicalizing tactics if the public is already super sympathetic and ready to work with you. And let me tell you, timing is quite literally everything. Sometimes a political window cracks open, but just for a fleeting moment. These windows are forced open by urgency drivers. It could be an emerging social trend, an administration with a ticking clock on its term limit, or a massive specific focal event. Take the tragic shooting of Breonna Taylor, for example. That single event temporarily pushed societal awareness of police brutality to unusual historical highs. For activists, events like that create this intense now-or-never urgency, because they know the 24-hour news cycle is inevitably going to move on. Next up is Section 4. Why do people join?
So zooming in on the human element, people don't just join a protest simply because they're angry. Showing up takes time, it takes money, and sometimes it involves genuine physical risk. The source material outlines some very distinct psychological drivers for why people actually get off the couch. First, there's a raw cost-benefit analysis. Basically, the oppression is bad enough that acting is finally better than suffering in silence. But then there's identity construction. People crave community. They want the catharsis of calling themselves an environmentalist or defender of rights. Then you have pure empathy, where allies join because they genuinely feel the pain of others. And yeah, we have to mention virtue signaling. Some people join primarily so they have a cool photo to post online to look good to their peers. But hey, most organizers will gladly take the numbers. Interestingly, because identity and community are such incredibly powerful drivers, positive encouragement, making someone feel like they belong, is usually vastly more effective for recruitment than trying to shame them into participating.
Let's look at Section 5, Avenues of Real Change. Okay, so the default assumption most of us have is that social movements only win by gathering millions and millions of people to form this unstoppable electoral voting bloc. But that's really just one tool in the toolbox. There are some incredibly effective alternative avenues for real change that don't rely on winning a national election at all. Movements can focus purely on cultural shifts, things like changing everyday behaviors, like making it totally socially unacceptable to use certain microaggressions. Or they can focus on forcing politicians out of silence. A local official might really want to ignore a controversial issue, but a small, loud, relentless movement can force them to publicly take a stance. Movements can also pressure corporations. Seriously, just a tiny fraction of a consumer base threatening a boycott can completely rewrite company policy. Or they can bypass the general public entirely and go straight through the courts, using a handful of highly specialized lawyers to lobby the Supreme Court for sweeping legal changes.
And that brings us to Section 6, Tactics, specifically violence and structure.
Now we are pivoting to some of the most debated strategic levers out there. Believe it or not, even the organizational chart of a movement is a tactic. Look at the difference between a traditional pyramid and a decentralized web. A movement can choose to be strictly hierarchical. Think of the civil rights movement with its very distinct prominent leaders. This structure grants respectability politics. It makes it way easier to secure big funding, keep your messaging totally uniform, and gain trusted inside lobbying access to politicians. However, horizontal or decentralized structures, like Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter, are highly deliberate choices too. Being completely decentralized prevents a movement from being quote-unquote decapitated if a single leader gets arrested or bought out. It allows for highly tailored local representation. And crucially, it sends a strong signal of anti-establishment purity. This deeply appeals to activists who are frankly disgusted by traditional top-down bureaucratic systems. All right, deep breath, because here is the toughest mental palate cleanser in movement analysis. When, if ever, is violence actually a strategic choice? Setting aside our own personal morality for just a moment to view this purely through the lens of strategic actor analysis, there is a very deep, very real debate between violent and peaceful tactics. Let's impartially steelman both sides exactly as the source text lays them out. Strategically speaking, violent action might be deemed necessary as an absolute last resort in a closed, illegitimate system. We saw this during the Arab Spring. It can force authoritarian militaries to fold, it can shatter a regime's strongman aura, it guarantees immense international media attention, and it can provide deep psychological catharsis for an oppressed population. On the flip side, peaceful action is often strictly enforced by organizers because, frankly, violence tends to completely alienate the broader public. Crucially, staying peaceful prevents the state from justifying brutal collective punishment against the movement. Furthermore, peaceful structures maintain accessibility. They ensure that women, the elderly, and children are actually physically safe enough to join the ranks and lend their crucial numbers to the cause. To really bring this whole explainer home, let's look at this defining quote from the analysis. How the movement is organized doesn't just happen by accident. It's a strategic choice. Everything we just talked about, every single layer of commitment, every choice between a watered-down or radical message, every decentralized local chapter or centralized leader, it's all a deliberate, calculated move designed to win a massive societal debate. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. The next time you see a protest on the evening news or you see a hashtag blowing up online, don't just look at the anger or the passion on the surface. Look a little deeper. Ask yourself, which strategic levers are these organizers actively pulling? Are they going for broad appeal? Or are they fighting for core purity? What painful trade-offs do they have to make just to get on your television screen? Once you start seeing the hidden anatomy of a social movement, I promise you're never going to look at the news the exact same way again. Thanks so much for joining me for this breakdown on The Explainer. And hey, keep asking the right questions.